Good afternoon. I am delighted to have you all join us today at National Black Child Development Week for our webinar, The Black Economy, Part 1, The Economic and Financial Impact of COVID-19 on Black Families. I'm Jocelyn Sturdivant, Senior Vice President for Institutional Advancement at the National Black Child Development Institute, also known as NBCDI, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. NBCDI is a nonprofit organization that was established 50 years ago in 1970. Our mission is to improve the lives of Black children and families through education and advocacy. We are one of the only national organizations dedicated exclusively to the success and well-being of Black children. We engage leaders, policymakers, parents, and the business community and other stakeholders around critical and timely issues that directly impact Black children and families. We're going to start off with a few housekeeping items. If you have a question for the speaker, please enter it in a Q&A section of your screen as opposed to the chat box. All audience members will be muted throughout the entire session, but we will read as many questions submitted in the Q&A section as we have time for at the end. And now I'd like to introduce our featured speaker for today's webinar, David Clunie, Executive Director of Black Economic Alliance. Black Economic Alliance is a coalition of business leaders and aligned advocates who seek prosperity and economic security for Black Americans with specific focus on work, wages, and wealth. David has an extensive and distinguished biography, and I will share a few highlights from it. From the Obama administration, where he helped advance economic policies to improve the lives of all Americans, to J.P. Morgan Chase & Company, where he helped lead the firm's engagement with public policymakers across the country on expanding more inclusive economic growth. David brings a wealth of invaluable experience and perspective from the public and private sectors to our webinar today. Before joining J.P. Morgan Chase, David was the Executive Secretary of the U.S. Department of the Treasury. He reached beyond his responsibilities in that role to improve economic prospects for all Americans, including his work to support and help grow the department's Minority and Women Inclusion Department. Before that, David served as Deputy Associate Counsel at the White House, and he has also practiced as a litigation attorney at the international law firm Paul Weiss. David is a graduate of Howard University School of Law and the University of Albany State University of New York. Welcome, David. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Great to be with you.
To set the landscape for today's discussion, I'd like us all to consider a recent op-ed published in the Chronicle. That's a newspaper that reports on topics of interest to the Black community in Charleston, South Carolina. The title of the op-ed is COVID-19 and Black America, Things a Vaccine Will Not Cure. In the op-ed, the writer says, old sayings often get to be old because they are most often true. One saying that comes to mind immediately suggests that when America gets a cold, Black America gets pneumonia. The writer goes on to say, COVID-19 has visited Black communities across this nation to once again remind us of our social, political, and economic vulnerable status as American citizens. We're not here today to endorse an op-ed, but to the writer's point, even before COVID-19, the average Black American family had total wealth of $17,600, less than 1/10 the wealth of the average white American family, which was $171,000, based on 2016 data. That is a statistic that the Brookings Institution describes as evidence of staggering racial disparities. Today, with David as our guest, we'll take a closer look at these issues with three goals in mind. We seek to understand the economic and financial impact of COVID-19 on Black Americans in general and Black families in particular. We hope to learn the most promising strategies for addressing the impact of COVID-19 on Black families. And we hope to leave with an understanding of next steps as part of a call to action to take in alignment with those strategies. I'll begin by asking David some questions, and then we'll allow time for the audience to ask questions at the end. We'll move quickly through some of the early concepts, so we'll have more time to get into the core of the discussion and have time for questions. David, let's start by having you explain as succinctly as possible some of the terminology that our guests will hear during the webinar. In a sentence or two, can you tell us briefly what is the difference between economic impact and financial impact as it relates to COVID-19?
Sure, I appreciate you asking that question, and thank you for having me. I think that is a distinction without a difference. I think a lot of the media, public policymakers, and just public discussion around the economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic have used the terms interchangeably. Typically, economic means you're talking about a macro economic look about how particular things affect the economy, the US economy or the global economy, and financial impacts, you're typically talking about how something impacts a particular company, or if you think about it in a more micro way, a family. I think for the purposes of this discussion, that those terms have been used interchangeably, and we're talking about the economic impact, how the pandemic is impacting the finances and economic outlook of, on the micro level, Black people, Black families, Black businesses; on the macro level, the Black community, and really the larger US economy.
Thank you, David. We will get into some sobering realities later in our discussion, but for now, can you paint a picture for us? Can you describe for us briefly Black Economic Alliance's vision? What does it mean to achieve prosperity and economic security for Black Americans?
Sure. So one of the reasons the Black Economic Alliance was started just over 2 years ago now, formally, is there is a need for much more focused attention, particularly from our public policymakers, but also from the private sector and from individuals alike, on just throughout the history of this country, Black folks, for a number of different reasons, and we've been in different places throughout the history of this country, we have not had en masse financial security as individuals or as a community. I think we've seen other communities have more and less success with it, and we just know that there is a need for us to put in place, both address some of the factors that have led us to financial insecurity over the years, and after addressing what has gotten us where we are, be able to very deliberately and strategically look at how you, I've been saying lately, how you shore up some of the cracks and the structural damage in the economy, particularly with respect to Black people. So our whole purpose at the Black Economic Alliance is to call out and address some of the structural damage, work with members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. I should note we are a nonpartisan organization, so we seek to really be focused on issues and policy, and in doing so, really help people understand how shoring up the structural damage in the Black economy and the Black community in turn helps the US economy, because if any group of people, but particularly Black folks in this case, continue to be a drag on the economy and are not doing well, the entire economy cannot prosper. So we are focused on addressing, calling out, addressing, and counteracting a lot of the structural factors, both in public policy, but also in practice, and even in private sector practices, things like redlining and home lending, for example, and reversing the trends on those by having very sober and honest conversations about how we got to where we are and what we need to do structurally to make sure we put Black Americans on a better trajectory toward financial health and security.
Thank you, David. Next, can you talk to us a little bit about work, wages, and wealth? I know that's a framework through which your organization views a lot of these issues. Perhaps that speaks to the structural damage that you have described. Tell us briefly what's useful about looking at these issues through that kind of framework, just briefly for now, and then we'll get into more detail about that later.
Sure. So we really thought about what things are top of mind for every Black person, every Black family, business owner, or employee, and work is something that essentially dictates so much of the rest of our lives. You know, your job, for example, will determine whether or not you have healthcare or access to affordable healthcare. The wages you receive for that job will often dictate your standard of living. And we know there is a wide gap in income, and there's been a lot of talk about income inequality, but a lot of that is around wages. And one of the, we talk about structural damages or structural things we need to fix in our system is, we know for years and for generations, Black folks have not been paid at the same rate as our counterparts, particularly our white counterparts. So with both work and wages, a lot of it is about the drivers of Black people and Black families and even Black businesses, their ability to kind of fully participate in the US economy. And then on wealth, you know, wealth building is something we are extremely focused on as an organization, because a number of structural things have kept us back from being able to build wealth over time. Obviously, things like slavery, obviously things like Jim Crow, mass incarceration, so many other structural things. But even if we think about programs, so an example I like to use is the National Housing Act. That was one of the programs that was put in place after the Great Depression as part of the New Deal. Categorically excluded Black people from being able to have access to and receive government-backed mortgages. So for better part of 30, 35 years, home building and home purchases were the primary driver of wealth building for Americans. And 98% of the loans that were given out under that program for over 30 years were given to white people, were given to white Americans. So if you think about what that means from a trajectory perspective and what trajectory that has put Black folks on for wealth building, there are a number of examples like that that we at the Black Economic Alliance are trying to turn around. So we're starting conversations and driving conversations about what things need to be done in the areas of work, wages, and wealth to wholesale put the Black community on a better trajectory toward financial security.
Thank you, David. So your comments tie directly into where I'd like to go next in our discussion. We'd like to shift now to issues related to COVID-19. And again, we'll start at a high level and then we'll really get into the core material. Can you start by giving us a big picture understanding, and that is, in a sentence or two, first, your overall assessment of how Black families were faring before COVID-19 in the areas of work, wages, and wealth. Then we'll talk about where we are now, and then next we'll go to what the future looks like. Again, for now, just at a high level, how were we doing before COVID-19?
So I think the statistic you pointed out is something that we have on our website at blackeconomicalliance.org, and it is a great benchmark for us to talk about. You know, before the pandemic, and I think these numbers came from 2017. You had a situation where Black Americans had the wealth that is 1/10 that of our white counterparts. And one of the interesting things is we talk about between the Great Depression and the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, Black families had been closing the wealth gap between white families and Black families over that long period of time at a very, very slow rate. And we had a long way to go anyway. But what happened in the Great Recession, 2009, between then and now, all of those gains were lost. So we were at a place where, although we had made significant gains over the years, we still had a long way to go in terms of our wealth. And I think we were in a place where Black folks' businesses were growing. So an example is Black businesses have been growing at a rate of 34%, I think, over the past decade, which is a higher rate of growth than our counterparts. One of the concerns is so many pieces of progress that we were making are now going to be completely turned around. So how we were doing before is we were making progress, but it was slow, and we were still really reeling from, I think, the Great Recession, where Black businesses grew at a higher rate, but the Black unemployment rate has continued to be, sometimes nearly twice that of the national unemployment rate. So the moniker when white America gets a cold, Black America gets pneumonia could not be truer than it is now.
Thank you. And so now here we are. We are living in the very new reality of COVID-19. It's only been a few months, but in your sense, what has changed in the last couple months since the onset of this pandemic?
So I'll note two things. One, I think just the way we're talking about economic outcomes and impacts. So I'll put the health outcomes to the side and let medical public health experts and doctors talk about that. But the economic side of that is tied into the health outcomes as well. And it's to say, Black folks have been more vulnerable to the outcomes of this pandemic, not only because of pre-existing conditions medically, but I say the pre-existing condition is the lack of access we have had to participate in the American economy, which leaves us more vulnerable to bad outcomes. So that's to say, Black families already had less disposable income and less in savings than our white counterparts. We talked about the wealth numbers being 1/10 that of white families. We're also over-indexed, Black folks, in the jobs that are at highest risk and also least able to work from home. So I think to put it in perspective, some national numbers on that I've seen say only 30% of the US workforce has even the ability to work from home, by the nature of their jobs. And Black folks, the jobs that have been lost, Black businesses rather, are in the 5 industries that have been hit the hardest. So the majority of us didn't have the opportunity or option to work from home in the first place. And second of all, a number of Black folks who have been impacted either by being furloughed, not being able to work as many hours, or having to find work that they can do during the pandemic, are at increased risk and exposure, both because they are not able to make ends meet and not able to work, continue to earn a living during the pandemic, but then also the folks who are working, we are overrepresented in the people who are on the front lines, and not as much the doctors and nurses, but more so, folks who are working in transit, are working at the reception desks at hospitals, who are, janitors and other administrative staff. So those folks are the people who are exposed by having to go to work every day. Also in places like New York, where I live, they need to take public transportation to get there. And then they're not being given PPE, personal protective equipment, at the same rate as folks who are, doctors and nurses. So in a number of ways, Black folks are more exposed and are, as we've seen reported on, experiencing worse outcomes, both from a health perspective and an economic perspective, largely because of the economic situation we found ourselves in before the pandemic started, which is many of us were vulnerable. Even if we were doing well, we were kind of on the cusp and could not weather a financial shock.
Thank you, David. I'm going to save the forward-looking question for a little bit later in our discussion. And what I'd like to do now is just talk more specifically around work, wages, and wealth. What are some of the challenges in each of these areas? Why has it been so difficult to make strides in these areas? Of course, feel free to share the extent to which we have made strides, but also just really help us gain a deeper understanding of why it has been so difficult to make progress. Let's first talk about work.
Sure. So, let's first talk about progress and not make this all negative. We have much more today than we did, let's say, 50 years ago, a Black business class, a working community of people who are in corporate America, who are entrepreneurs, who are, fully participating in the economy and have a voice. And that is, again, largely the reason that that BEA came together and was largely brought together by senior corporate executives, business owners, CEOs, who said, we have a voice, we have a platform. How can we collectively come together and leverage the collective power we have, the collective dollars we have, the collective knowledge and network and influence we have to be a better and louder and more effective voice for economic opportunity for the entire Black community. So that is a place where we've seen progress. We are participating in the economy at a higher rate. We have increased representation, even though there is such a long way to go in terms of, you know, Black CEOs, Black folks on corporate boards of directors. It is more in the conversation now. You have, you know, companies and others who have diversity, inclusion, and equity departments, but there is still a long way to go there. So then I turn to, you know, where we are on work today, you know, and some of the challenges. I think a lot of it has to do with the types of jobs that Black folks are in at higher numbers, and a lot of that has to do with the access to, you know, let me step back. Many of us have heard, and if you haven't, that your zip code is one of the biggest determinants of, you know, your lot in life, your earning potential, your educational trajectory. So in large numbers, Black folks, you know, our communities do not have the same investment that our counterparts do in the way of public schools, in the way of pathways to build wealth. So one of the real challenges with work is that we have already been over-indexed in jobs that don't have a very long future, that, you know, don't even make ends meet. You know, the concept of working poor. There are a number of folks in our community who work more than one job and still don't have enough money to make ends meet. So one of the real issues with work has been getting the proper pipelines and skills training to get folks into jobs that can provide a living wage and also can provide a long trajectory of financial security. And before the pandemic, Black people were over-indexed in jobs that are starting to go away with transformation, with modernization. And one of the things we've been talking to Congress about a lot is making sure that there are proper data and metrics around where the demand is and where jobs really are, and also plugging in and supporting job training programs, pipeline programs, and also doing things like, you know, removing the 4-year college degree requirement for jobs that just don't, where it's not necessary. We were working on that when I was in the private sector, and, you know, at a place like JP Morgan Chase, where they employ 250,000 employees, they were able to see over 50,000 of their jobs didn't actually require a 4-year degree. So there are a number of things we needed to do to put ourselves on a better trajectory. Now that we're in the pandemic, I think that trend is just being exacerbated and being accelerated. So it's really important that we focus on the economy of the future, both where it was already going before the pandemic, but the reality that during the pandemic, a lot of jobs are going to be lost that are just not going to come back. So we need to be focusing on how we, you know where the demand is going to be, and also are putting people in positions to succeed by getting them the training and the pipelines necessary to get in on the work side.
Thank you, David. So even when we address work issues, are there still independent issues around wages that we still need to contend with? Share more detail around that. Again, both the good stories, but also challenges that we are still having to address around wages, even as we address the work issue.
Certainly. So many of us are probably aware of the public debate that's been going on around minimum wage, both as a part of the presidential campaign. You'll hear local politicians talking about it. There have been a number of cities and states who have passed laws to increase their minimum wage to somewhere like $15 an hour or more. I would step back from that conversation and look at the larger issue, which is the average American is unable to make ends meet. And if you're looking at minimum wage, you know, as an indicator, I think it's correct that in most cases, somebody making even $15 an hour has a hard time making ends meet. But there's a balance with that, which is, you know, if we force small businesses, for example, to pay a certain wage, they may be able to employ and hire fewer employees. And I'll say, you know, small businesses are such a big part of this conversation around work wages and wealth, because, you know, they are such a big part of the U.S. economy, such a big part of the Black economy. And during the Great Recession, for example, in the Black community, Black small businesses, Black-owned small businesses added, I think, something like 1.8 million jobs between 2007 and 2012, whereas white-owned businesses lost 700,000 jobs during that same period. So We want to be able to create an environment where small businesses and large can pay a wage where their employees have what they need to make ends meet, can also get access to healthcare and basically have the wraparound services they need for a good standard of living, but also that allows these small businesses and large businesses to be able to operate. So on wages, there have been a number of studies, and I think the more information that is disclosed, some states, for example, some states and cities have started to require that companies, as a means to drive income equality, that they report how much different folks that work for them are making and how it breaks down based on race. I think the more we are talking about it openly, and the more we are addressing some of the historic inequities there, I think we'll continue to make progress. There is a long way to go. I think both for people of color and for women. So it's something we need to keep talking about in open forums and highlighting good examples of companies that are able to both pay a good living wage, but also kind of make a living on their own. I will say that is something that I think is in significant jeopardy during the pandemic, because you've seen companies that have grown at just a ridiculous rate, like some of the tech companies in Silicon Valley are now, things have just come to a complete stop, or their growth has, seen a significant slowdown. So a lot of folks have been cutting jobs lately. You've seen a number of companies, I won't name them, have been in the news in the last few days, cutting 25% of their workforce, cutting 5,000 employees at a time. And again, I think that's a place where Black folks, may be over-indexed in the people who are losing their jobs and then not able to get back into the workforce. So work and wages, I think, are very closely aligned. And in order for us to get people into jobs that will, provide them the ability to make a living, they have to be making a living wage to do it. Because if you're working 3-4 jobs and still not making ends meet, that's not helping the individual. That's not helping the economy. And that will become both an economic and a health risk to anybody in that situation.
Thank you, David. That's really a helpful way of helping us understand the interconnection between work and wages. And of course, there is the third tier, wealth. We started off talking about a 90% differential between the wealth of Black families and white families. And that was years ago, 4 years before this pandemic. So here we are now in 2020, talk about wealth as it pertains to Black families amid the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, this is one that and all of these are an immediate concern, but wealth, because we already were not in a position where, as a community, we were building proper pipelines to wealth building, like home ownership, like retirement savings, like invest in different investments. This is something we really need to focus on, because even if we are able to find immediate relief or short-term relief, for example, if Black folks are still on a trajectory to not be doing well down the road, that's going to be a drag on the entire economy, and obviously you'll have a lot of people who are in bad situations individually. A statistic that my old employer used to use is that I think in the next 50 years, if the trajectory remained, this was before the pandemic, if the current trajectory of wealth remained, the average Black family wealth would be zero, which is a crazy concept to think before the pandemic we were already on that trajectory. I think obviously we talked about before, the pandemic is just exacerbating the trends that were existent before the pandemic began. So wealth building is a huge concern, and it's something that if we don't make very bold action, and if we don't change the trajectory and really reset the direction that our economy was headed in, both Black Americans and everybody else, I think it'll just speed up what was already going to happen, which is Black family wealth continuing to dwindle. So one of the things we've been talking to Congress about a lot, and the private sector as well, is not only thinking about in immediate terms about what needs to be done, to get people cash in their hands, to meet their obligations for the next month or two. That's absolutely important, and that is priority number one. So we're talking about that, but we also need to be focused on what things do we need to do. Congress has passed the largest piece of legislation in American history at over $2 trillion in the CARES Act. If you think about, I talked about the Great Depression earlier. If you think about things like the New Deal, I think we are at a moment where we're legislating in a similar posture to what we were during the Great Depression and after. So we think about, just like I talked about with the National Housing Act, what trajectory we're going to put the economy on, and who is going to be situated well and not. We have to be both acknowledging and addressing and counteracting a lot of the structural inequities that have been in our system. And a lot of that has to do with access to capital. A lot of that has to do with access to the different parts of the economy that have been drivers of wealth that Black folks en masse just have not had access to. So we at the Black Economic Alliance are extremely focused on really trying to make sure that not only are we looking at a month or two down the road, but we're looking at 3 years down the road, 5 years down the road, and what things we need to do to get Black folks more access to rent to own options in their homes, changing zoning laws sometimes to allow for more affordable housing and multifamily housing in places that are crowded, helping increase and improve infrastructure so that Black folks can have and everybody can have access to live close enough to well-paying jobs. So this is really a global and macro look at the drivers of wealth in the economy and what obstacles have been in place, really acknowledging them and working hard to remove them as we move forward toward what I think will be a new economy post this pandemic, during and post the pandemic.
Thank you so much, David. You have taken us right to the place I'd like to go next in our discussion. We both represent strength-based organizations focused on the needs of Black Americans, Black families. We're realistic about the challenges we face, but we also like to stand and work in possibility. We know that there are incredible strengths in the Black community, Black families, the Black business sector, and although we have faced tremendous challenges, we have much to draw on. And so does the United States as the larger nation in which we operate. So with all of that in mind, you've alluded to some remedies already, but let's spend a little bit more time talking about the most promising strategies for recovering from some of these setbacks around work, wages, and wealth, many of which were already in place as we've discussed, and many more to come. What's the Black Economic Alliance focused on? What kind of timetable are we looking at? You painted a very stark picture of the amount of time that would be required if we don't do anything. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about remedies. Let's talk about what kind of timeline might be involved.
So let me start by saying, I don't think any government official, any nonprofit organization, or any private sector company has it all figured out on their own. And I don't think anybody has a plan, for the next 1 year or 5 years that will put everybody on a better trajectory. But the things that give me hope and that are promising are, one, I think similar to after any national pandemic or emergency, think about a situation like 9/11, people come together and figure out how they can be helpful to each other. So I think one of the promising things is that we are having more open conversations about structural inequities, both economically and from a health perspective, than we ever have before, than I've seen in my time in public policy. So it is a great starting place to be able to say, there's an agreement among everybody at the table that there are issues in our background that have contributed to the current situation, and that you don't have either Black Americans or any other groups of people kind of crying wolf and just not working hard enough to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. So I think that's a great starting place. Some of the other things that give me promise are people coming together, as I talked about after emergencies. We have, there is the opportunity for us to really leverage the full resources of the public sector, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector. And I think there's more of an appreciation now than there has been in the past of the need for this engagement from all of those sectors, and that no one sector is going to be able to handle it on their own. And that we're at our best and able to really tackle biggest problems when we're working together in tandem, plugging up holes, filling voids, and really, collaborating with each other. And I've been encouraged by the amount of appetite from the public sector and the private sector even on, wanting input from organizations like the Black Economic Alliance and our partners. We work very closely with the NAACP, the National Urban League, the U.S. Black Chamber of Commerce, and others, on trying to be a voice for the community, for the different, parts of our community and all the issues that that are most relevant. So, if you think about the political moment we're in, before 3 months ago, we were talking about a big election that's going to happen this year. And I think, as national issues always come up, kitchen table issues, people, there's a term, whiff 'em, what's in it for me? I think this is an election where everybody can think about, whoever is in place at the city level, at the state level, at the county level, and at the national level in the House, the Senate, and in the White House. There's a very real opportunity for everybody to personalize this election and say, I can see how whoever my leader is at different levels is impacting my, ability to make a living, my, ability to get good information. I feel safe or I don't because of the way that they're responding to this. So I will say, I think one of the things that's promising is we're coming up on, we've said this about many elections in recent years, but I will confidently say this is the most important election of our lifetimes. And, like I talked about, we're a nonpartisan organization, but we do support candidates who prioritize and really work with us on legislating and putting at the top of their list of priorities the economic kind of health and outcomes of the Black community and how that ties into the larger economy, not just because they're trying to do a favor for Black folks, but because they understand that the success of the Black community economically is inextricably tied to the success of the U.S. economy. So I think those major concepts give me hope. On a micro level, some of the things that we've seen just in, between the first and second rounds of stimulus funding, the Paycheck Protection Program, for example, has gotten a ton of attention as a program that was set up to prop up small businesses and help them, make it through this pandemic. And they've tied loan dollars at a very low interest rate of 1% that even turn into grants from the government via the SBA, the Small Business Administration. And essentially they're meant to both give businesses the capital they need to stay afloat, but also to encourage businesses to keep their employees on board. And if they do, then some or all of that money will turn into a grant instead of a loan. What is highlighted is in the first round, billions, hundreds of billions of dollars were pushed out the door, over $300 billion in this program, and a small percentage of it went to people of color and women-owned businesses. And it just highlighted the reality that there is a significant lack of access to capital in the Black community. So promising things I've seen are things like in the second tranche, and this is after a lot of, we made a call for Congress to do certain guarantees and set-asides for, folks, Black-owned small businesses, and even the institutions that lend to them, community development financial institutions and minority depository institutions, for money to be set aside for those organizations. Because if you do a first come, first served situation like what happened the first time around, the reality is the folks who don't have access will continue to not have access. And the folks who do will get calls from their bankers saying, hey, this program is coming out tomorrow. Give me all your information. We'll have it ready to press in. And the people who have never been plugged into the SBA infrastructure just have no chance at all. So in the second round, I just saw some of the public numbers on how much money went to small businesses of color, or how much money more so went to community development financial institutions and minority depository institutions. And it is beyond tenfold of what happened the first time around. And that's because there was a recognition that you need to you need to make special dispensation or very deliberate and particular policies that are directed at making sure the money gets to the places it's needed the most, and acknowledge the obstacles to that happening if you just kind of put it out there and let the system that is already in place have its way and kind of work as it always has. So those are some of the promising things. I will reiterate, nobody has it all figured out, so we have a lot of work to do, but there are some promising things about how we could end up in a better situation than we are in now.
Sure, thank you. And thank you in particular for some of the comments you just made with regard to a second round of funding. I just saw a comment come through that acknowledges that while some did benefit from that first round, there are many who did not, and many simply perhaps did not act quickly enough, but for the most part, structurally, there were so many barriers to participation.
That's right.
So that is a very helpful thing to know, that there's been an understanding of what has caused many to miss out on some of the remedies that are already in place. We do have a few questions coming in, and we will get to those pretty shortly. But before we do that, one of the most important things that we like to do here with National Black Child Development Week is talk about a call to action. So here today on our call and participating all week are organizations, individuals, allies of Black children and families who are really eager to be part of the solution. So for those participating today, for those who may watch a recording of this session later, what are some of the immediate steps, perhaps 1 to 3 things that organizations, individuals, and allies could take? What could they walk away from this conversation as a type of marching order to address some of the issues, the challenges, and promising strategies that we've talked about today?
I appreciate that question, and I love a call to action. So 3 things I'll say. One is information. Both avail yourself of information about what is available in the way of resources and help and support, but more importantly, people should be talking about finances, economic well-being much more than we do. And I think in our community, it's been something we have not been very comfortable talking about. I even think about in my own family, like, our parents were talking about money. It was kind of grown folks' business and we didn't talk about it. I think information is extremely powerful and there's a lot of it out there. So I think the organizations who are here, thinking about the channels you have to push out information to your membership about, things they should be thinking about both in the immediate term and in the long term. And even if that's, pointing them toward organizations like Black Economic Alliance or others who are making information available about what people should be thinking about and focused on around their finances. And I think planning, one of the things about like some of the forbearance issues that forbearance measures that have been put in place by banks, they require you to reach out to your mortgage holder or your, whoever holds your car loan or even your insurance and say, as you've seen, there's a pandemic happening. Can we organize a different arrangement where we can figure out how I can pay on a more reasonable schedule? And in many cases, they're willing to do that. If you don't reach out, they will not do it. So that kind of thing is a thing that people need to know. So I think information is key, both availing yourself of it and using the channels you have in your organizations to get it out to people. And don't assume that folks know any of the things that you come across, even in this conversation today. Perhaps this should have been number 1, but I'll make it number 2 since I already talked about it. Civic engagement is crucial. The first thing you can all do is vote, 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 vote. And I think this year where, the pandemic is making it uncertain about how, where, and when people will vote, ask that question early. So Google, where do I vote? What are my options? There are a number of states that have passed early voting laws and are now allowing people, like New York is one of them, now allow people to vote absentee without having to say that they're actually unavailable on election day, but they're just trying to give people more options to vote early, and that's either in person or by mail. So start asking now, ask your friends, talk to others about how, where, and when you vote. and get that process, settled as quickly as possible. But also civic engagement is about engaging with your public officials. Speak up, tell them what you need. That has been driving the day on a lot of the things that have been getting into the stimulus packages that are coming out of the federal government. A lot of states are starting to act now to set up facilities for support both on the individual side and on the business side. So reach out to your members of Congress, reach out to your other representatives at the state, local, and city level. Tell them what your needs are, tell them where you're from, tell them about what's happening in your neighborhood, because that's another place where Black folks, we have not had enough of a political voice. And the more we do it en masse and the more we do it in higher numbers, the more impact we will have. And then third is collaborate. I think this is a great conversation and a great opportunity for different organizations to be working together. I talked earlier about, working among the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. So I would encourage folks here, for the partnerships that you have, leverage those partnerships, look for opportunities to bring more folks around the table, and even serve as examples of how organizations either in the same sector or in different sectors can be working together to attack some of the problems that none of us individually have the resources to handle in a comprehensive way.
Thank you so much, David. We have learned so much today about the economic and financial impact of COVID-19. I hope that we have accomplished, the audience feels that we've accomplished the goals that we laid out in the beginning. I feel that we have. We've gotten into the core issues around work, wages, and wealth. We've learned strategies, and we have just received a call to action, some very specific steps that we can take. I know there are many questions that have come in, and if it's okay with you, I would like to get into those now with the time that we have left.
I'd love to.
Okay, great. So, so the first question is, how can we increase our income now? Should we move our stock into a secure account? A very specific financial question. So I will say that this is not perhaps a forum to give direct financial advice, but if you could speak generally to the concern. We are in a very vulnerable period, some without income, some with limited income, and even those with income, very concerned about how to protect ourselves and our families. Any words of wisdom around that question?
Yeah, so I will stay far away from giving investment advice, which would not be wise for anybody. But that's a very subjective, very personal question about where you are in your personal finances and what your future needs are. The advice I would give is to have a very real conversation with yourself, with your family, and do an assessment of what your financial obligations are, in the short term, in the next few weeks and months, and even in the longer term, and start to what I've seen people do successfully is start to put themselves in a position to kind of, I always like to say, prepare for the worst, but hope for the best. What we don't know is how long this pandemic is going to last. And it's been just one of the toughest environments to plan in because this is a level of uncertainty we've just never seen before. And I'll just make a side note. I can't explain what the stock market is doing. It doesn't like uncertainty, but it seems to be having kind of an opposite. It will go up, it'll go down, it continues to go up, but it's up on the year, and the NASDAQ is anyway. So I think if you have a financial advisor, talk to them, but most importantly, talk to your family, talk to the people who hold your loans, whether it's a car loan, a home loan, insurance, whatever it is, and have an open dialogue with them about what the next few weeks and months look like, and then what the longer term looks like, and don't anything left unaddressed is in bad shape. So I think digging in and really trying to plan as much as you possibly can. I know a lot of people have been trying to reduce their expenses. I have a friend who's a small business owner, for example, who has decided to move, out of their very high rent apartment in Brooklyn, upstate New York, to a house, that his wife's family has, where they can live for free for a few months while he figures out what he's going to do with his business. And what they're going to do as a family. So to the extent you have the opportunity to do things like that, I think that's great. But without giving, particular advice, it's all about planning and being very honest with yourself about what your obligations are and what your options are to position yourself for the next few weeks and months.
Wonderful. And we have two more. So the next question is, how can we fix the issues for the low-income families? That is a general question, but what I hear in that question is, what can we do? There's so many ways in which, even when we seek to remedy problems in the United States, it seems that the remedies benefit folks who are already have an advantage.
Right.
You know, so often the folks who are most in need continue to be in need even after a very extensive stimulus package, for example, or other extraordinary measures such as the ones we saw after the 2008 recession. So what can be done? How do we solve this issue of low-income families, particularly Black families, as it relates to our conversation today, always getting overlooked, always getting the short end of the stick, always ending up with less and less and less?
Number one, vote. Vote, vote, vote. Vote for people who prioritize disinvested communities, people who have historically been left behind, and acknowledge that this is a reality. So that's number one. Number two is continuing to call out the need for specific provisions that are targeted at and directly dedicated to the people who need the resources the most. So like I talked about with the Paycheck Protection Program earlier, it's not a silver bullet. There's still a lot of people who need access who don't have it. But I think we were able to achieve something just in the difference between the first wave and the second wave by talking about a set aside that created a second lane and a separate point of access and entry for the system and programs that we know were not benefiting some of the people who needed it the most. Being able to do that in more ways around jobs, around skills training, around affordable housing and others. I think we have a moment right now where I talked about earlier, public policymakers, members of the media, and others are talking about historical and structural inequities more than we ever have before. So being able to legislate, being able to drive programs and policies, not only in the public sector by legislation, federal, state, and local, but also among private sector companies, talking to banks about the different things they can do to create more access to capital. And I know that was a live conversation I had when I was in the private sector, and it's something that they're continually trying to do. But I think the more it becomes a standard and a national conversation, the higher of a priority it will be. So, vote, vote, vote. But also call out in every public space you can, but particularly directly with your elected representatives, the need to make specific provisions and even in some cases set asides or direct programs for the people who have continued to be left out.
Thank you. And one more question. Could Mr. Clunie share his take on how stimulus efforts should be distributed among small businesses? For example, micro businesses versus larger small businesses?
Great question. So just like minority and women-owned businesses were disadvantaged in the first round of Paycheck Protection Program funding, some micro businesses and small businesses, businesses with, let's say, 10 or fewer, or even 20 or fewer employees, were disadvantaged. And I will say there's a lot of overlap between micro businesses and Black-owned businesses. I think the last number I saw was 94% of Black-owned businesses are sole proprietorships. So that is the vast majority of the market of Black-owned businesses are micro businesses. So what is being done in future tranches is really trying to, similar to the set-asides that were made for community development financial institutions and minority depository institutions, who are typically the banks that lend and the organizations that lend to micro businesses. We are looking for more set-asides and direct funding for micro businesses. In fact, the Black Economic Alliance just last week endorsed and backed a plan that was put out by Senator Kamala Harris and Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, trying to direct funds to create a fund for micro businesses to receive a special set of funding that is set aside. And that's exactly the kind of thing we're trying to do, learning some of the lessons from the first and even the second wave. So again, I think we need to be calling out the reality of some of the inequities in our system, and micro businesses is a very big one. And I think the louder our voices get on this and the more support we get for it, the better of a chance we'll have of it getting implemented, similar to the set-asides for CDFIs in the last PPP round of funding.
Thank you. Well, we've come to the end of our time, and David, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I have learned so much from this as a moderator, and I do hope our audience has learned a great deal as well. Really appreciate your responses, very clear, very targeted, and very lots and lots of substance to help us really understand how COVID-19 is affecting us financially and economically. I'd like to thank our audience as well for joining us. We got to read some great questions. I'd like to acknowledge the many comments that came in. We didn't have time to get into all those, but really do appreciate that participation. We'd like everyone to be with us on Thursday, May 14th from 1 to 2 p.m. for part 2 of this webinar. And we will focus on gaining financial health in Black communities beyond COVID-19, the role of Black small businesses. There's more to come today at National Black Child Development Week, so stay tuned. David, thank you again. And in closing, I would like all of you to be aware, as you know, COVID-19 has made it hard for many families to meet their basic needs. NBCDI is responding by creating the NBCDI Supporting Communities COVID-19 Matching Campaign. We'd love your support. We are working with faith-based communities in Maryland and Chicago to make meals available to families who need them. NBCDI will match up to the first $7,500 in donations.